in the humid stillness of a Massachusetts coastal afternoon, where the salty ocean breeze drifted lazily through the open windows of my sister Lauren's Cape-style house. The clatter of lobster shells cracking under metal crackers echoed like small explosions against the polished oak table, each sharp sound digging a little deeper into my composure, as my 9-year-old son, Ethan, sat silently between his cousins, his small hands folded neatly in his lap as if he'd been trained his whole life to take up less space than he deserved. And it was in that suspended moment of absurd domestic normalcy that Lauren, without even glancing at him, without the slightest tremor of hesitation, pushed a plastic cup of lukewarm tap water toward him and said in a flat, dismissive tone, "We don't feed extras." A sentence so casually cruel it cleaved the room in half and left a cold, ringing absence in the space where maternal kindness should have been. And though the open windows filled the house with the scent of butter and seafood and summer sweetness, I suddenly felt as though the air itself had thickened with something rotten, something invisible but heavy, something that pressed against my chest as Ethan lifted the cup with a small, polite smile like it didn't bother him. Like the watered-down kindness he'd been handed was something he ought to be grateful for. And I kept replaying the absurdity in my mind that I had bought the groceries, all $180 of them, because Lauren claimed she'd been tight on cash. And I had believed her, had shown up early to help her prepare the feast, had watched her take the bags from my hands with a breezy, entitled nod, had let myself assume that the gesture would naturally extend to my child. But now, watching him sip his water while the twins gnawed on thick lobster claws dripping with golden butter, I felt something in me shift. Not the explosive kind of anger that surges and fades, but a colder, deeper, eerily steady quiet, a stillness that spread through me like frost crawling over a window pane. And it was in that stillness that I noticed the details, the way Lauren's smile brightened only when she looked at her own children, the subtle pride glowing in her as they feasted on luxury, the deliberate ways she avoided my gaze when she set the rules of hierarchy at her table. And yet, I didn't say a word, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because some betrayals demand observation rather than reaction. And as I watched Ethan chew on nothing but the inside of his own cheek, pretending he wasn't hungry, pretending he didn't notice the difference between him and the others, a quiet vow took shape inside me, expanding slowly, cleanly, purposefully, a vow that whispered that this moment would not be forgotten, that there would be consequences, not in the childish, dramatic sense of revenge that erupts in shouts and slammed doors, but in the adult, psychological sense, the kind that unfolds like a chess game played on a board only I could see. And while Lauren chatted about her weekend plans and summer camp registrations and renovation projects, every sentence dripping with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world rotated in a neat circle around her needs, I paid attention, memorizing the rhythm of her voice, the shape of her confidence, the blind spots she didn't even know she had, because the best revenge doesn't scream, it studies. And as dinner dragged on, as the twins wiped butter-streaked fingers on monogram napkins, while Ethan stared quietly at the tablecloth, tracing the stitched pattern of seashells with his thumbnail, I allowed myself to notice how the other adults didn't even flinch at what was happening, how they either didn't register the imbalance or had grown used to Lauren's self-designated hierarchy. And I wondered how many times I had overlooked similar moments, how many small cruelties I had dismissed as quirks or stress or poor judgment because I wanted to keep the peace, because I believed family was worth forgiving, because I thought love could excuse everything. And yet here, at this table, under the halo of warm pendant lights, with the sunset staining the sky outside her picture window, I realized that love, true love, should never require a child to swallow his hunger in silence, should never leave him questioning his worth. And by the time dessert was served only to the twins, by the time Lauren laughed and told me she'd catch up later because she had mom stuff to do, by the time I gathered Ethan's backpack and guided him toward the car while he murmured, "I wasn't that hungry anyway," in a voice too soft and too practiced, the vow inside me had crystallized into something sharp and clear. I would not protect Lauren from the consequences of her own cruelty. I would simply step back, withdraw, let her reveal herself to the world without me smoothing her edges or cushioning her impact. And in that quiet retreat, more powerful than any confrontation, I felt the first cold, quiet shift of revenge settling into place, as steady as the tide pulling back from the shore before a storm. In the days that followed that humiliating afternoon in Lauren's Lobster perfume dining room, I discovered the strange, precise power of silence. Not the passive kind that hopes things will magically improve, but the intentional, surgical kind that cuts deeper than confrontation ever could. And as I moved through my Massachusetts home, packing Ethan's lunch, answering work emails, organizing the laundry, each simple action felt like a stitch in a new boundary forming between us and her, a boundary she didn't even know existed yet. I stopped texting first, stopped suggesting weekend visits, stopped filling the cracks of her life with my presence the way I always had. And it was shocking how quickly the absence of my effort revealed the hollowness of our relationship, as if I had been the scaffolding holding up the illusion of sisterly closeness. And once my support was gone, everything sagged. At first, she didn't notice. I was expected to orbit her, expected to adjust myself around her demands and moods. But slowly, inevitably, the silence reached her. Because people like Lauren don't fear loneliness, they fear irrelevance. And my absence began to eat at her like termites, quietly devouring the beams of her confidence. She texted, "You coming over this weekend?" And when I simply replied, "We're busy," she waited exactly 18 minutes before sending, "Is everything okay?" To which I responded, "All good," offering her no foothold, no spark to ignite the dramatic scene she desperately craved. Because psychological revenge is a discipline, a patience, a refusal to play the role someone expects of you. Meanwhile, Ethan thrived in the peace of our distance. No more long drives to a house where he felt like a guest rather than family. No more pretending he wasn't hungry. No more polite smiles hiding discomfort. And instead, he spent weekends at home drawing superheroes, reading his favorite mystery books, helping me bake banana bread. He laughed more, and every laugh made my resolve harder, clearer, more immovable. But while we healed, Lauren unraveled. Mom started asking questions, subtle at first. "Haven't seen you and Ethan at family dinner lately." And although I kept my answers vague, Ethan did not, because children don't wrap truth in politeness. When Mom asked him gently why he didn't want to go to Aunt Lauren's anymore, he simply said, "She didn't let me eat." And those 5 words, spoken with the matter-of-fact honesty of a child, hit my mother with the quiet force of a confession she didn't know she'd been waiting for. Mom called me that night, voice tight with shock, and said, "She fed everyone lobster and gave Ethan water?" And something in her tone told me this wasn't going away. Mothers remember every slight to their grandchildren like a personal wound, and Mom, who had always defended Lauren's stress or forgetfulness, suddenly saw her in a different light, as if the fog of years of excuses had evaporated in an instant. She called Lauren next, and though I wasn't on the line, I knew exactly how it went. Mom's calm voice sharpened to a blade, Lauren deflecting, minimizing, pretending she'd forgotten or didn't think it was a big deal. And for the first time in our lives, Mom didn't buy it, didn't bend, didn't rescue her. And that crack, just one, was all it took to destabilize Lauren's carefully curated world. Because in our family, Mom's disappointment carries a weight no apology can lift, and soon the whispers spread quietly among extended relatives, not because I shared anything, but because guilt always leaks. People noticed we weren't visiting her anymore, noticed she seemed jittery, defensive, overly cheerful at carefully timed moments. And in our suburban American community, where reputations form social currency, Lauren began to feel the slow, suffocating loss of the moral high ground she'd always taken for granted. She texted me again. "Mom is overreacting, right? Tell her Ethan wasn't upset." And when I didn't respond, when I let the truth stand unsoftened, the silence became a mirror she couldn't escape. Days later, she showed up unannounced at my house, knocking with the frantic rhythm of someone who'd rehearsed a speech in her car and lost her nerve halfway through. And when I opened the door, she plastered on a smile stretched so thin it looked painful, saying, "Hey, haven't seen you in forever." But I didn't step aside to let her in, just leaned against the doorframe and waited. She scrambled for footing, words tumbling out too fast. "I feel like you're avoiding me. Did something happen? You know I love Ethan, right?" But I maintained that same quiet, steady voice that unnerved her so much more than anger ever could, replying, "We're just focused on ourselves lately." And the way her smile faltered, the way her eyes darted as she searched my face for a hint of forgiveness or emotional entry point, told me she understood, on some primitive instinctual level, that something had shifted, that she had lost a position she didn't even know she'd been holding. She wanted a confrontation, a catharsis, a big emotional explosion she could spin into a story where she wasn't the villain. But I gave her nothing. No anger, no tears, no yelling. And in that void, she was left alone with the echo of her own actions. She left soon after, her composure cracking around the edges. And later that night, I received a text so unlike her, I read it twice. "I think something's wrong between us. Tell me what you need me to do." That was when I realized the true power of emotional revenge. It wasn't about punishing her. It was about making her finally see herself without the comforting veil of denial. She wanted me to list demands, to give her tasks so she could perform remorse instead of feeling it. But I offered only silence again, because the lesson wasn't mine to teach. It was hers to confront. And in that slow, deliberate pullback, the balance of power permanently shifted, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple, searing truth that once you stop trying to belong to someone who treats you as optional, they become the optional one instead. And Lauren, suddenly stripped of the unearned authority she had wielded for years, began to unravel in the emptiness I left behind. Not because I pushed her out, but because I finally stopped holding her up. 4th of July crept over our Massachusetts town with its usual mix of patriotic bravado and suburban competitiveness. The parade banners flopping along Wayne Street, the distant pop of firecrackers from teenagers who couldn't wait until dark, the smell of charcoal and sunscreen drifting through neighborhoods where lawns were mowed to perfection, as if the entire country had decided that freedom required immaculate landscaping. And, in the center of it all, as always, was Lauren, who prided herself on hosting the biggest, most elaborate 4th of July barbecue on our block, a tradition she'd curated like a personal brand, complete with color-coordinated decorations, catered sides disguised as homemade, and invitations worded just ambiguous enough to sound exclusive. She loved the attention, the compliments, the illusion of being the gravitational force that held the neighborhood together. And in previous years, I had helped her set up, organize her guest list, arrange her patriotic centerpieces, even grilled while she mingled. But this year, for the first time, her texts asking for help went unanswered. Her subtle guilt trips dissolved into the void, and the silence seemed to slither under her skin like a slow-burning irritant she couldn't scratch. Meanwhile, I planned something small, quiet, and deceptively simple. A casual cookout in my backyard 2 days before the holiday. Nothing fancy, just burgers, corn on the cob, lemonade, and the kind of warmth that doesn't require decorations or performances. And when I extended the invitation, I did it with honesty, not persuasion, expecting only a handful of close friends to show up. But word spread faster than I intended. Partly because people genuinely enjoyed being around Ethan, partly because the Lobster incident had leaked through the community grapevine in that strange, untraceable way suburban scandals always do, and partly because Lauren's carefully maintained persona had begun to crumble, making people curious, perhaps even relieved to shift their loyalty towards someone who didn't demand admiration as payment for hospitality. On the day of the cookout, guests flowed into my yard like a gentle tide, neighbors carrying homemade side dishes, kids racing across the lawn with sparklers shaped like stars, older folks settling into lawn chairs while the grill hissed and crackled, and I watched as Ethan laughed with children who saw him as an equal, not an afterthought, and the sound of his joy blended with the hum of conversation, forming a harmony that felt like healing stitched into the air. Meanwhile, Lauren hosted her traditional pre-4th dinner that same evening, expecting the usual crowd, expecting to dominate the social calendar the way she always had. But as the sun dipped low behind the trees and her driveway stayed eerily empty, she must have felt the truth in her bones long before she saw the photos online. Neighbors posting snapshots of my cookout, children holding s'mores over a fire pit, mom sitting beside me with her arm around Ethan, the caption, "A perfect start to the holiday weekend," glowing on the screen like an indictment. She didn't text me that night, which told me everything. She was terrified, furious, unraveling, but too proud to admit it, too afraid to ask the question burning through her ego: why did everyone choose me instead of her? The next day, a neighbor mentioned casually that Lauren's party had been a bit quiet this year, which was polite suburb speak for a complete social collapse, and part of me wondered if I should feel guilty. But when I remembered the look on Ethan's face at her table, the forced smile, the hunger, the humiliation, the guilt evaporated like morning dew under fire. And yet, the revenge unfolding wasn't vindictive or cruel, it was restorative, a recalibration of balance rather than punishment. Because I hadn't stolen anything from her. I had simply stopped propping her up, and without the scaffolding of my labor, her image crumbled under its own weight. 2 days later, on the morning of the 4th, when flags waved from porches and children painted their faces red, white, and blue, Lauren appeared at my door again. This time, looking less angry and more afraid, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "Can we talk?" And though I hadn't planned on extending the scene that far, I stepped outside, leaning against the doorframe as she shifted anxiously on the brick steps, her polished confidence nowhere to be found. She took a shaky breath and said, "Everyone went to your cookout. Everyone. Do you have any idea how that made me look?" And I almost laughed at the irony. She was more distressed about public perception than about the cruelty that had caused it. But instead of feeding her illusions, I simply replied, "People go where they feel welcomed," and watched her swallow the words like bitter medicine. She opened and closed her mouth, eyes glistening with the beginnings of frustration or perhaps shame, though it was hard to tell which. And then she asked the question she never imagined she'd have to ask me, "Tell me what I'm supposed to do." And the desperation in her voice cracked something inside me. Not sympathy, but clarity. She wanted me to give her a script, to guide her back to social safety, to rebuild her image for her. But that wasn't my role anymore. The only person she needed to impress was Ethan, and she had lost that privilege, maybe forever. So I looked at her and said, "That's something you'll have to figure out on your own." And the way her face fell, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of responsibility she'd avoided her whole life, told me the message had finally sunk in. She left without saying goodbye, and that night, as fireworks burst across the sky in red and gold arcs that reflected off our windows, Ethan curled beside me on the couch, tired and happy, and I felt something close to closure. Not because the revenge was complete, but because I realized it was never really about Lauren at all. It was about Ethan understanding his worth, about me refusing to let anyone, family or not, make him feel less. And as the final firework erupted in a crackling bloom above the town, I knew that Lauren's unraveling wasn't the end of the story, just the middle. And something darker, sharper, more definitive, was still coming in the aftermath of her desperate attempt to rebuild what she had so carelessly shattered. In the weeks after the 4th of July, when the smoke from the fireworks had long faded and the neighborhood returned to its quiet cadence of lawnmowers, dog walkers, and porch lights flickering on at dusk, Lauren spiraled through a cycle of frantic gestures, texts laden with over-apologies, voicemails attempting shaky humor, invitations to catch up delivered with an almost brittle cheerfulness, but I responded only when necessary, measured, polite, and emotionally unreachable. Because by then I understood that true revenge wasn't about punishing her, it was about letting her feel the echo of the neglect she had inflicted on Ethan, letting her sit in the silence she had earned, letting her discover that family bonds, once snapped, don't simply reattach because one party suddenly fears the consequences of their own cruelty. Meanwhile, Mom's disappointment shadowed Lauren like a permanent cloud, small enough to follow her unnoticed but heavy enough to shape her every step. And though Mom never once yelled or lectured, her subtle withdrawal, canceling brunches, skipping casual visits, stopping the little favors she always did, created a tension that stretched through Lauren's life like a hairline crack in glass, invisible from a distance but devastating up close. Neighbors who once admired her now treated her with cautious politeness, as though they sensed something flawed beneath her bright exterior. And every time someone mentioned my cookout or praised how comfortable and real it felt, she flinched as if stung, realizing she had been dethroned from a kingdom she believed she was entitled to rule. Yet the final shift didn't come from the community or even from Mom. It came from Ethan, whose quiet strength had grown in the safety of distance. And one afternoon, when I asked gently whether he wanted to give Aunt Lauren another chance, he shook his head with a calm certainty far too mature for a 9-year-old, saying, "She made me feel like I don't matter." And those simple words, soft, unembellished, undeniably true, became the anchor of my final decision, because children rarely remember the specifics of birthday gifts or expensive meals, but they never forget how someone made them feel. And that memory becomes part of their wiring, their self-worth, their understanding of who sees them and who doesn't. So when Thanksgiving came, a holiday Lauren had always dominated, I deliberately kept things small, choosing instead to accept Mom's invitation for a quiet dinner at her house. The table wasn't lavish, the dishes weren't picture perfect, but the warmth was real. And as we ate pumpkin pie and watched Ethan laugh with his cousins, I felt the clean, quiet triumphs of choosing peace over performance, truth over appearance, safety over tradition. Halfway through the evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Lauren. "Are you coming? We waited." And I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle before typing back, "We're with Mom. Have a good night." A sentence so simple yet so final that it cleared the air like a sudden breeze cutting through heavy humidity. She didn't reply, not that night, not the next, and for a moment I wondered if I had been too harsh, but then I remembered Ethan's small voice saying, "She made me feel like I don't matter," and any lingering guilt dissolved into resolute. Weeks later, she asked to meet, and though part of me braced for drama, she arrived subdued, almost deflated, her bravado drained, her makeup understated, her posture uncertain, as though she'd rehearsed humility for the first time in her life. She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "I know I can't undo what I did, and I don't expect things to go back to normal, but I want to understand how to be better." And for the first time, her words felt unperformed, genuine in a way I almost didn't recognize. And I realized the revenge had already done its work. Not by breaking her, but by revealing her to herself. I didn't offer forgiveness, because forgiveness wasn't the point, nor did I offer reconciliation, because reconciliation wasn't earned. I simply said, "The only place to start is with Ethan." And the way her eyes filled, not with self-pity, but with something closer to remorse, told me she finally understood the magnitude of that responsibility. Still, I didn't reopen the door to our former closeness, because protecting my son meant honoring the boundaries he needed, not the comfort she wanted. And so we settled into a new quiet, civil, distant, cautious, like two people who once shared a map but now walk separate paths. By Christmas, she had adjusted to the emptiness of being optional rather than essential, and I had embraced the peace of no longer orbiting someone who took more than she gave. The final cut wasn't dramatic or loud. It happened slowly, gently, cleanly, like a rope fraying until it finally slips apart, leaving each end free. And as winter settled over New England, snow frosting rooftops and holiday lights glowing through frosted windows, Ethan curled beside me on the couch, warm and safe, his head resting on my shoulder while we watched the tree twinkle in the dark, and I knew the story was finished, not because Lauren had paid for what she had done, but because I had refused to let her define his worth. And in that refusal, in that quiet, unwavering protection, lay the truest, most enduring revenge of all. We healed without her, and she had to live with the space she carved out of our lives.